Hi all, so today let's talk a bit about the manurial world, the manurial system, and especially the role that supplies, reserves and famines had in the functioning of this system. Um, Manurial system, we're definitely talking about the High Middle Ages, so this system that is really difficult to define as such from a merely material point of view, because the idea of a manor, of a sort of center, in this case fortified, in which there were people inside working land, subjected to a lord, and then outside free peasantry that somehow became dependent on the Lord's the Lord's influence and economical and military power, especially at the point of even de facto losing their own freedom, is something you find very broadly in many societies, and this is probably one of the most interesting aspects of studying pre-industrial in pre-industrial societies and their economy. Not much because of economics itself, that it's very difficult, by the way. I'm no expert about economical history, but it's broadly known that, especially for such ancient times like these, there is really very little consensus among scholars regarding even macroscopical phenomena and quantities, such as how many people lived at that time in Europe, on how much how what was the crop yield, that in this case is during medieval history is basically at the base of the whole economical system. But it's still very interesting to see how different societies in different times and places in history did somehow relatively similar things. Here the manurial system in the High Middle Ages is in the moment in which feudalism was developing. And feudalism was really born out of systems that were already, in terms of clientelary system, similar to the feudal one. What really made the difference in many ways was the proportions of land owning, in short, how the land was distributed, how much a single owner had in his hands. And when we talk about the manorial system in Europe, we don't obviously have to conceive it as a sort of strict defined system with its own rules and quantities that were equal all over Europe, but not even in post-Carolingian Europe, where this system was growing. There were enormous differences between, I don't know, Britain and Italy, or between Germany or France, and this obviously affected greatly the whole. It's in a sense the same reflection of different societies, different political system that influenced and were influenced by the economical system. And talking about supplies and reserves and famines during in the manorial system, we have to first of all to say that the main characteristics of this system was obviously this progressive stratification of society, in which there was a lord at the top and an increasing number of people that in part were mostly originally freemen, free peasants, free people who, because of their economical condition and their increasing poverty that happened for many reasons, became poor. So there was a system where there were a lot of people working at the base, and one guy, or at least an aristocracy that was obviously an elite in many ways, and especially numerically and quantitatively speaking, over the rest of the population, which instead disposed of these goods and eventually used them for its own aims. And we shouldn't read this in a classist way. There isn't really historiography since a long time went far past this classist interpretation of this society of the poor guys that were exploited just by lords, because really what happened into the manorial system is that very far from seeing these noblemen basically owning everything they had for themselves, you see that there was an enormous competition between the same lords and the attached communities of peasants and serfs, as they were slowly becoming, that couldn't contemplate the idea of having some goods and not using them for no reason, just for treasurizing and accumulating for no use. These were systems where war was endemic, where there was a lot of violence, where especially there was still a lot of strength from the peasant communities that weren't absolutely so submissive or incapable of acting against the nobles, that over which the same lords fought. I mean, certain peasant communities had certain deals with a lord, and then and from the other side other deals with another, and they really played it politically for their own interests and so on. So necessarily the lords had to invest their own resources in order to compete and to struggle like the others into this system. However, it is true in this feudal Europe information that that the supplies and resources owned by these aristocracy were increasingly large, were, especially in comparison of the average peasant, enormous. And this granted obviously to these landowners, in spite of all, to accumulate very huge supplies in storehouses that belonged to them, seigneurial storehouses, that, however, were often emptied, were often so all these supplies constantly consumed. And for many reasons, and we can say that in a world that was largely based on agricultural, from an economical point of view, on agriculture and crops yield, and with a very low income, in fact, over time, that all these quantities would be used wisely. Because Lord could have a lot of supplies, but that meant that the value for them was the same, and especially because it was a big supply, lords were required to know how to invest it properly in order to save what they had accumulated. And in this system, we're talking mostly about the manorial system was something that was largely launched by the Carolingian vassalatic beneficiary system. This idea that there were a few people owning a huge quantity of goods because the kings had entrusted these to them, and from the other side, however, there was still the obvious duty from these vassals and minor aristocracy towards towards the same kings, towards the same royal power that still owned rights, basically, and especially on in post-Carolingian Europe, over theoretically everything, aside perhaps the ecclesiastical and the ecclesiastical property. One thing was, we talked about wars before. Well, when the kings, doesn't matter how weak they were in comparison to the Carolingian ones, when the Carolingian Empire collapsed, but France, Germany, Italy still had kings, and they still had powerful aristocracies, and these kings would make war, obviously, and make campaigns, and as every military historian knows, you can't make a campaign without food, without supplies. They are gonna be consumed quite easily, and are therefore required in very large quantities. For which there was the so-called foraging right of the kings. That was one of the most basic, in fact, in all medieval Europe. The so-called fodrum in Latin. That was especially in this sense always required to kings, because kings usually would cede other rights, either minor rights over, I don't know, the meals using or bridge passing or other stuff to the minor vassals. But usually, since they were the first ones to wage war on average and to require these supplies to be used, the fodrum was normally one of the first rights in feudal Europe that was standardly required to the local communities. Even those communities who struggled the most against the royal power. Think about Frederick Barbarossa in Italy, had when he was defeated eventually by the Lombard League. One of the few things that actually remained as a right that the Italian cities had owed to the king was in fact the fodrum, because it was such an ancient standard right required by the king that that it couldn't be even in those conditions discussed. Also because there was a sort of common benefit from it, because the kings usually put up these expeditions that were normally used at least to, if not to defend all the time, the local communities, at least to make war that could protect their interests. So it was quite easy, especially for people who weren't so militarized like rich citizens in towns, to just pay for this fodrum, that and let the king eventually employing that resource on its own, then participating to the actual war. In fact, the fodrum was basically owed both in nature and in gold, dependingly, or money. I mean, what I mean that is that whatever thing was useful. Usually, money is something that you don't find so often, at least not in large quantities, especially during the time of the manorial system in the 9th and 10th century. Because that was a moment of crisis, generally speaking, at least compared to the periods that had followed and that had just passed. But generally speaking, at this point, Europe, in spite of minor setbacks, is still on the rise from the 8th century. So you find that the economy, there is an increase of monetary circulation, which was, by the way, the same thing that made eventually the manorial system collapse in a certain sense, because eventually cities became, during the 11th century, the main centers of the main economic centers. They were much more competitive for many reasons, because they had better connections than castles, scattered in the hinterland, and there were more people working there, so producing more, even as in a sort of proto-industrial fashion. Therefore, the manorial system collapsed in that sense. But at the same time, the manorial system wasn't at all a closed system, as it's often thought. On the contrary, from the original Germanic average asset of, all small owners, doing their own business, the manorial systems sort of concentrated large quantities, in fact, of resources in the hands of people who, in this sense, had broader horizons in economical terms, and also pushed and helped very much the same economical rebirth of the 11th century by giving a more rational and coordinated use and distribution of these resources for building even infrastructures and so on, and that made eventually the rebirth of the 11th century possible. And however, another point that definitely had that made the storehouses in these lords' castle moats, especially in this period, vanishing, would be famines. Famines were, quite are quite frequent, and in the agricultural in an agricultural working system, especially with the technologies of the time, bad weather, or excessive hot weather, or floods, or even the arrival of parasites that would kill the plantations was indeed very frequent. If you read the whole, the chronicles of every time of medieval history, you will find that every once in a while, with more or less frequency, there would be, natural disasters that would bring the crops to fail essentially for a season, and this would cause a shortage of food and people would die. There are obviously even larger cycles that we can measure, that are studied since, by historiography, by centuries, that you would see this cycle of production and then population growth. Then the population is too large and maybe there is a famine, and people die because there is no food, and then the cycle begins again. This was all normal, and in this sense it is even more useful to understand how dynamic these systems were, because when you were really entrusting your first source of income on something that could fail statistically every once in a while, it was obviously risking, and this meant that even political or strategical planification would be difficult to do even in medium terms, time terms. So this tells you how desperate sometimes the fights between the various lords all over Europe in this period were, and why there were such a ferocious competitions, because also the economical system pushed in a certain sense towards this direction. But there was one political game that was practicable by the lords during famines, which was not very nice, but indeed tells you how eventually the feudal system even had tools to transform the social system and to feed this eventual social stratification and the forming of an elite that was increasingly powerful over the majority of peasants, was the fact that famines would mostly hit the peasant communities, which might seem strange because obviously the peasant communities were the guys who eventually produced materially in larger numbers the food. This is true, but as we have seen, the single peasants were less organized than lords, Often these peasants, in order to secure their crops, would stock them into the lord's manor, and therefore when the famine happened, it was frequent that the lord would have stocked a very large supply of food, and that he could use that to mitigate and to condition and to tie to himself the peasant communities. Because when there was one famine, we don't have to think that lords would starve the peasants. Also because if you starve the peasants that you are cooperating with, that you are protecting, you don't have people who work your lands. There was also a lot of migration policy carried out by these lords, as we were saying before, also in competitive terms, in order to win and gain more or less workers. One of the greatest problems in this sense was that, I don't know, families of peasants would move to another lord because he could grant them better working contracts, and there was this this play over it. So the lord wouldn't starve the peasants to death, obviously, but it still would use that power to keep things down. I mean, not to satisfy immediately the needs of peasants, also because most of the times maybe he wouldn't even have all the necessary amounts of food to feed them all after famine, but it would say, okay, I give you food, but what do you give me back in this condition? And then the peasants would lose rights in this process, becoming always more dependent on the lord's power. And you understand how it was easy to make of supplies and production a political tool to shape society at your advantage. And we must say, however, that there were other forms. We were saying about the fodrum. I forgot about that. I was saying that in what the lords would usually give this food was when the king arrived and they said, you owe me this quantity of food by right, and the lord would have to pay for this fodrum, these foraging rights. And I wanted to conclude on that by saying that actually much of the logistical system of Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe would work exactly in this way. You might wonder how, in the Carolingian Empire, with the technology of the time and even the relatively poor asset of Europe in the early or high Middle Ages, how you want to consider them, the Carolingians could move armies of thousands, even often with many horses and other animals that would have to eat necessarily, could move these armies for thousands of miles across Europe. Well, one of these means was indeed this stock system that, especially in the Carolingian age, was very developed. There were stations where food was stocked by local counts or bishops, and later these would and obviously the same counts and bishops would have food on their own, because they had to provide to the king and for themselves, and their own forces that they would lead eventually with the king himself alongside with him. And we can say that during the post-Carolingian period, this system eventually transformed itself into this, the idea that the original stations would become simply storehouses of the European aristocracy that would keep using it to help kings during their military campaigns, but that at the same time would help themselves for the same military campaigns that they carried out. Think about France, where vassals were factually much more powerful than the king himself in many cases. So they also had to rely on this logistical system that could afford them, and much was done through their own vassals in turn, and would start from a very local base. However, what I wanted to say is that exactly in this second period, so in the fullest of the manorial system period, aristocracy would use stock and supplies also to would consume it also to carry out other things, other activities that in a certain sense characterized the manorial system in itself, and this rising European aristocracy that was substantially defining itself from a class point of view, even to recognize itself as such. Which is the kind of aristocracy of blood, of lineage that you can find, eventually formalized in low and especially later Middle Ages. And part of these activities were obviously related, not in fact just to the interaction of and the administrative with the local agrarian communities. And these and the administration of the properties that the aristocracy owned, that indeed required expenses, because if you want, I don't know, people to pay for a mill to be used in your property, you have to ensure at least the mill is functional. So there is a cost of maintenance and all this stuff. The same goes especially for communications, for roads, bridges, and even police operations, because this was, a moment of political fragmentation, that there was no strong central authority on average, and brigands would be everywhere, and even the same local communities had to be kept down with troops, with armed men that had to be paid and often lived, as we know, in the lord's moats and defend them. Even structuring a moat and fortifying your territory was important, so a lot of expenses, but we can see the consumption of supplies also for something else, that was simply the lord's splendor and luxury. The idea that you are near aristocrat not just because you've made a deal with local communities that in turn, then in exchange for your protection, pay you money, but also and goods, especially money, we said, were rare, especially from peasant communities. Obviously, they would pay in nature most of the times, but also the construction of another concept. That is the idea that you were an aristocrat, not because of this contractualistic condition that it was shaped in this way, but also because you were somehow more special than the others, that you belonged to a noble family that had therefore the right of living better than others, that had to show the wealth in clothes, in weaponry. The time of the manorial system was still a very poor moment in terms of material culture, and even having obviously an armor was something like today you have a private jet, like so. Even in something that we see mostly as functional, was a symbolism and a greatness. Having a horse, for instance, a war horse, and finding the time to train yourself at fighting on horseback, and all this stuff that was mostly a symbol of power, beyond the strictly military function, um, which is very interesting. Consider in fact how the political awareness of these aristocrats was. The idea that in a fragmented political situation they could and had even the right to take what they wanted, which is obviously a very different mindset from ours, but has to be understood in fact in the context of those times. And this didn't happen just for laymen, because we think that the Lord was usually a lay. No, there were also very powerful clergymen that would use weapons and go to war as well. Also, because according to Carolingian rites, at least the bishops had to bring their own army in person, at least on the battlefield, or at least at the camp where the king told them to do. And as we know, many of them even fought. But these in the ecclesiastical property could these luxes we were talking about in the ecclesiastical aristocracy could equate to for instance, the liturgical pomp. As we said, in military aristocracy, it was the ostentation of weapons and horses. But here, even in the ecclesiastical world, having very good, very expensive regalia and vests was very important. It was to make the believers show the might of the church, and stressing the wealth of a family that maybe had invested for that guy to become a bishop or an abbot, and that therefore proved it by honoring God through these magnificence. But there was a lot of more pragmatic reasons behind that, because for instance, for a noble family in this way, founding for instance a monastery and sending cadet sons to become abbots, for instance, was also a good investment, because monasteries were protected by the laws of the kingdom. They had ecclesiastical immunity, and therefore, if you as long as that monastery was faithful to you to the abbots that belonged to your family, you could store in these monasteries very expensive furniture, very expensive material that you could in turn retake from your relatives there, and that was a very good investment. And it seems to have been one of the most clever and one of the safest, especially in this world that was indeed a very dynamic one, and not at all sort of a sleeping Europe where nothing happened and things were slow and change was rare. No, we see a great competition and great dynamicity, as well as much through the whole Middle Ages. And we don't have to forget that this luxus, however, as we said before, wasn't only just treasured. It wasn't felt even as such, because there was a tradition of hospitality that we can find both in the Germanic tradition, that belonged mainly to the lay establishment, even in Latin areas where, however, the feudal system had spread, and therefore praised the Germanic values of a guy on a horseback fighting as a warrior, but also the Christian one. The idea that we are all brothers and sisters, and therefore we have to help each other and being hospitable. And therefore these generous welcomings with gifts, according to a tradition of a very old tradition of philanthropy and hospitality, that, as we said, reinterpreted either in a language of a religious evangelic meaning, but also and at the same time showing a very important seigneurial wealth and prodigality, was used at various levels of societies, both towards the poor that were indeed gifted regularly with something, especially from the church, but also in the lay world. We have seen how the lords would engage peasants into their duties, and even into their army, into their police patrols, and how some of these peasants would make a career into the seigneurial administration and become lords in their turn, because this is much of how much of low medieval aristocracy actually rose from the ranks, we can say. But it was a prodigality that was shown, and especially and very much also because it left the greatest traces of this towards the powerful, towards the kings or princes or abbots or bishops that would be very very costly and expensively hosted by and hosted and accommodated and lodged by the various communities, and also very expensively dismissed, and meaning that just imagine, I don't know, a king, but even it could be a duke or a marquis, or a bishop or an abbot came, was passing through your lands, and you were a lord. Well, you would spend all you had towards that important figure. Why? For just hospitality? But obviously not. But just maybe for buying that person's favor, and to establish political relations, or simply economical affairs, because maybe, I don't know, that bishop interacted from the city with your manor, and you would send goods to the cities, and you could have rights that were ensured by the bishop or by the abbot or by the king himself. Or maybe you wanted to make your daughter marrying to someone of higher rank, to make even your house rising in power and prestige. I mean, there were many reasons. If you would take everything out in terms of goods, and to show off also the best clothes. Think how expensive they could be, and especially food. Food was really, up to the 13th century, where economics was more a matter of money than of natural goods. Food was one of the most important things. You can see that even, I don't know, a proper gift for a king would be I don't know, very delicious pike. For instance, Louis the Ninth was gifted by I don't remember if it was an abbot in France, I don't remember, or in Burgundy, I don't remember. He was gifted with wine. Wine was a beautiful gift for a king, and a very saucy pike that had been fished in some lake of very big dimensions, and that was a kingly gift. Even hams or fruit, or especially in the medieval world, the best things would be the very, especially in Northern Europe, the fat meat, the idea of something consistent with a lot of calories that could support the body of a great warrior like a king could be. So there were a lot of there was a lot of symbolism attached to these munificence, and we can imagine how competitive this system was. And one of the what we were saying before about the fact that the manorial system was quite competitive, both from a political, military, but also from an economical point of view. You know, making the best gift, for instance, could mean to open your manorial properties to broader economical nets and trade routes that would bring very sophisticated goods, something coming even from the east, the east with spices and precious textiles and all this stuff that eventually put European economics in motion. It's true that much of history was conditioned by, you know, production, but it's also true there was a lot of, in terms of politics, that pushed for these goods and other, you know, and other resources to be put in motion through a will, through a desire, through a hate, through a love. You know, well, a lot of aspects that are definitely fascinating, and always keep your mind focused on how this was all interconnected. I mean, the Lord, you know, carrying out these policies and the peasants working for it, and then wars and trade and interests of any sort. And all of this is very important. It's very beautiful, and it makes you understand how strongly we have to refuse the idea of the manorial system as a closed system. It wasn't at all, and it was the next step for from the early Middle Ages to build the premises for the development during the economical development of Europe during the low Middle Ages. So I hope you enjoyed this video, as always, and as always I recommend you to share it if you wanna make anyone looking at it. That's really best gift you can give me, because that's the way you can make my channel grow. Otherwise, just leave a like or comment if you have any question. And if you have any curiosity, specific curiosity, always keep in mind the opportunity that I'm giving you in this time to make a video with for you, or about a personalized theme that can be about medieval history, about general history, whatever you like. If I can, you can message me and I will take into consideration your proposal, and we can really make this community start growing. Still at the beginning, but really hopeful for, you know, for a bright development of this channel. So if you had the patience to listen to me up to this point, I thank you for the attention, and I wish you a great time, and see you next time. Bye.